She was only 18 years old, with dreams of one day stepping onto the big stage. On September 25, 2005, Sally Anne Bowman was just a few steps away from her front door, but she never made it home. Her death sparked one of London's largest investigations and exposed a chilling truth about a predator who had lived unnoticed among ordinary people for far too long. Sally Anne Bowman was born on September 11, 1987, to her parents Linda and Paul. She was bright, kind-hearted, and full of life. Mature beyond her years, Sally Anne decided to take on independence early, moving out of her parents' home to rent a room and start supporting herself. Even after leaving home in her late teens, she always stayed close to her family, making sure to spend time with them as often as she could. Her loved ones remembered her as someone vibrant and full of joy, who shared her energy with everyone around her. The arts were her true passion. Sally Anne was accepted into the prestigious Brit School for Performing Arts, a place known for famous alumni like actor Tom Holland and singers Adele and Amy Winehouse. For her, it was a remarkable achievement and one more step toward her dream of performing on stage. Alongside her studies, she also pursued a modeling career, seizing every opportunity to move forward. At just 18 years old, Sally Anne was standing on the edge of a promising future, filled with hope and potential. On September 24, 2005, 18-year-old Sally Anne spent the day at her mother's house. That evening, her sister Nicole called and invited her to a birthday party for one of her closest friends. At around 6 p.m., Sally Anne got ready and left. As she walked down the driveway, her mother told her she loved her, and Sally Anne said she loved her back. In the heart of Croydon, she met up with her sister and friends. CCTV footage later showed her laughing, dancing, and enjoying the night out. As the evening came to an end, the sisters left the bar and walked back into Croydon's town center. Not long after, Sally Anne started speaking on the phone with her ex-boyfriend, Lewis Sproston. Their relationship had ended only weeks earlier, but she was eager to see him. She took a taxi back into Croydon where Lewis met her in his car. He picked her up at about 2:20 a.m. and drove her toward her rented room on Blenheim Crescent. But with emotions still raw after their breakup, the car ride quickly turned into an argument. It lasted until about 4:15 a.m. when Sally Anne stepped out of the car and Lewis drove away. That night, a local resident was jolted awake by a strange noise that ended with a piercing scream. He looked out of his window, but the street outside was silent and empty. A few minutes later, he checked again, this time keeping his lights off, and noticed a man walking down the road. With nothing else happening, he eventually returned to bed. At around 6:30 a.m., another neighbor stepped outside and noticed what looked like the legs of a mannequin sticking out from behind a builder's skip. As he got closer, he was met with a horrifying reality. It was the body of Sally Anne Bowman. She was partially undressed, and it was immediately clear that she was no longer alive. Police rushed to the scene, sealing off the area. A homicide squad was called in, and what followed became one of the largest murder investigations London had ever seen. When Linda Bowman heard a knock at the door, she thought it was Sally Anne, locked out and waiting to be let in. But when she opened the door, 3 police officers were standing there. They asked if she was Linda Bowman and if she knew Sally Anne. Linda confirmed that Sally Anne was her youngest daughter. That's when the officers delivered the devastating news. Her daughter had been found dead, the victim of a brutal attack. Linda later recalled that in that moment her entire world collapsed. She screamed in shock and disbelief. Soon after, Sally Anne's sister Michelle was also told the tragic news. Michelle described feeling as though something inside her broke that day, a piece of her that would never return. Just hours into the investigation, the Bowman family faced one of the most heartbreaking tasks imaginable, formally identifying Sally Anne's body. Michelle later recalled that when she first walked into the room, she thought for a split second it wasn't her. The hair looked darker, but as she stepped closer, she recognized her sister by her small, button nose and freckles. That was the moment the reality hit. Their devastated mother said she completely fell apart the moment she saw her daughter. Michelle, in tears, begged her mom, "Please wake her up. Please wake her up." 2 days after Sally Ann's body was discovered, the family made the painful decision to ask the police for more details about what had happened that night. A few days later, Detective Stuart Cundy arrived at the Bowman home with fellow officers to share what investigators had uncovered. The exact sequence of events after Sally Ann stepped out of her ex-boyfriend's car remained unclear, but investigators determined that she had been standing in the driveway of her home, just 30 feet from her front door, when she was suddenly attacked with rage and brutality. Sally Ann suffered at least 7 stab wounds, 3 of which were so forceful they went completely through her body. Evidence also suggested a sexual assault, as well as post-mortem desecration. Bite marks left on her body provided crucial DNA, evidence that would later unlock the case. The quiet of this suburban street had been shattered. A sadistic and violent killer was on the loose. The first suspect to come under scrutiny was Sally Ann's ex-boyfriend, Louis Sproston. Their argument that night, and the fact that he was one of the last people to see her alive, made him the immediate focus of the investigation. Police quickly launched a search. Louis was soon located with his brother and a friend. He identified himself willingly and was taken into custody. Over the next 4 days, investigators questioned him and collected his DNA. Louis insisted he had no knowledge of what happened to Sally Ann until officers told him the news. At first glance, it seemed like an open and shut case, a fight between former lovers that spiraled into tragedy. But when the forensic results came back, they revealed something no one expected. The DNA found on Sally Ann's body was a match, but not to Louis. Instead, it matched a sexual assault case from 4 years earlier, just a mile and a half from where Sally Ann had been murdered. Louis was released and detectives were suddenly racing against time. A dangerous predator was free, his crimes escalating in brutality. That raised chilling questions. What had he been doing in the years between 2001 and 2005? How many more victims were there, and most of all, where and when would he strike again? The answer to when the killer might strike again came almost immediately. Less than an hour before Sally Ann Bowman was murdered outside her home, another woman had been attacked just streets away, on Sanderstead Road. She had been standing on the street talking on her cell phone when a man came up behind her. He said just one word, "Sorry," before striking her. Detectives believed that if not for a passing taxi, the attack would have escalated into something far worse. As the man fled, he snatched her phone. The call was still connected, and the person on the other end heard everything. What was most disturbing was that the screams didn't fade, meaning the attacker had stayed nearby, watching. Thankfully, the taxi driver quickly got the woman into his cab and rushed her to the hospital. The victim was able to provide a detailed description. A white male, between 20 and 30 years old, around 5'9" to 6 feet tall, proportionate build, with short dark hair. An e-fit was created and widely distributed, bringing in many calls from the public. Yet the breakthrough investigators needed never came. The murder squad turned back to the one piece of evidence they knew could solve the case: the DNA found on Sally Ann's body. Detectives believed the killer was local and knew the area well. That's why they launched a massive DNA sweep. 6,000 addresses to check, 4,000 men fitting the description in South Croydon. The odds of the killer volunteering his DNA were slim, but investigators hoped that perhaps a relative, a brother, a father, might step forward, providing the crucial link they needed. Despite initial progress, 6 months after the murder, the investigation began to stall. In South Croydon, fear was growing. Residents didn't know where or when the killer might strike again. By March 2006, police decided it was time for a new approach. Investigators returned to the e-fit of the man who had attacked a woman just an hour before Sally Ann Bowman was killed. They were convinced it was the same individual. At the same time, they also released a new e-fit linked to the phone box assault from 2001. The DNA from that case matched the profile found on Sally Ann's body. Back then, the victim had not created an e-fit, but detectives now hoped she could provide fresh details that might finally move the investigation forward. After consulting with Sally Ann's family, police decided to take the case to the public. They wanted people to understand just how brutal this murder had been and how dangerous the killer still was. A press conference was held, generating new leads, but none of them brought the breakthrough investigators needed. Then came a turning point. About 20 miles from Croydon in the town of Crawley, a man was drinking heavily in a pub while watching England take on Trinidad and Tobago in the World Cup. Intoxicated, he got into an argument with another man. The fight spilled out onto the street where CCTV cameras captured the scuffle. When the man shoved his opponent to the ground, a nearby police officer stepped in and made an arrest. The suspect was identified as 35-year-old Mark Dixie. He was taken in for questioning, and officers immediately noticed his strange behavior, unusually tearful and overly emotional for such a minor incident. As procedure required, his fingerprints and a DNA sample were collected before he was released on bail. 12 days later, investigators received the call they had been waiting for. The DNA recovered from Anne Bowman's body was a confirmed match to Mark Dixie. Now, the race was on to track him down before he struck again. To the investigators' dismay, Mark Dixie had already fled the country and gone into hiding in Amsterdam. He stayed there for about 3 months, but after an argument with his landlord, he returned to the United Kingdom and found work as a pub chef. During his earlier arrest for a street fight, he had listed the pub's address as his residence. Knowing how dangerous he was, and aware of his easy access to knives in the kitchen, police decided they had to move quickly. As officers were scouting the building for a side entrance, Dixie walked out on his own. They immediately apprehended him and took him into custody. One of the arresting officers later recalled placing a hand on Dixie's chest to stop him. His heartbeat was steady, unchanged, as if he felt no fear at all. The only words he spoke during booking were, "I must have been mad to have done that." The following day, Mark Dixie was formally charged with the murder of Anne Bowman. He remained silent as the charges were read. Later that evening, around 9 p.m., Family Liaison Officer Graham Bannatyne called Linda Bowman and came to her home. He was finally able to deliver the news the devastated family had been waiting for. The man who had taken Anne's life was now behind bars. But the haunting question remained: who exactly was Mark Dixie and how had he managed to evade capture for so long? Mark Dixie was born in Streatham in 1970. His childhood was far from stable. When he was just 18 months old, his parents divorced. Later, his mother remarried, and he took his stepfather's surname, becoming Mark James MacDonald. Over the years, he hid behind several aliases, including Mark Philip Dixie, Mark James Down, Stephen MacDonald, and Shane Turner. At one point, he was even placed in a children's home. It was during those years that his path into crime began. At that time, DNA profiling was not yet mandatory with every arrest, a fact that would allow Dixie's crimes to go unchecked for years. In 1986, he robbed a woman at knife point in Stockwell and served 6 weeks in prison. Just a year later, he was convicted of robbery again. By 1988, he received a 2-year sentence for an indecent assault and causing bodily harm. In 1989, he was convicted of indecent exposure and sentenced to 80 hours of community service. A year later, in 1990, he appeared in court once again, this time for assaulting a police officer. But this was only the beginning. To investigators' horror, Dixie's crimes would not be limited to the United Kingdom. In 1993, he moved to Australia, where he quickly overstayed his visa, and soon began yet another string of offenses. In 1998, a 19-year-old student from Thailand was home alone in Perth when she heard a noise coming from her kitchen. Curious, she went to check, and came face to face with Mark Dixie. He had a nylon stocking pulled over his head and a knife in his hand. The young woman was stabbed multiple times and lost consciousness. Dixie then carried out a sexual assault, stole her belongings, and fled the scene. Thankfully, she survived, though the attack left deep emotional scars. But his violence didn't stop there. On January 1, 1999, Dixie spotted a young woman jogging near the town of Bunbury, a few hours south of Perth. He pulled over, hid in the bushes, and ambushed her, demanding degrading acts. For this, he was fined $750 just 3 days later. By April of that year, he was deported from Australia. Once Mark Dixie was formally charged with the murder of Sally Ann Bowman, the investigation was far from over. For the next 18 months, police painstakingly pieced together his movements to understand how and why he had taken the life of an 18-year-old girl. They needed the case to be airtight. Investigators learned that on September 24th, the very night Sally Ann was killed, Dixie had been out celebrating his birthday. He spent the evening in a pub on Brighton Road, just a few hundred yards from Sally Ann's home on Blenheim Crescent. Birthdays were significant to him, and former partners said he always demanded special attention on that day. That night, his partner stayed home. After a phone call with her, he returned to the table noticeably changed, withdrawn, angry, and brooding. He spent the rest of the night drinking heavily and taking drugs. When the pub closed, he went with two female friends to a house on Avondale Road, only a short distance from Sally Ann's home. The women went to bed, but Dixie did not. Police believe that sometime between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., Dixie left the house armed with a knife, determined to find a victim. Detectives are convinced he was the man who attacked a woman on Sanderstead Road earlier that night, only to be interrupted by a passing taxi. Frustrated, he made his way to Blenheim Crescent, where Sally Ann tragically happened to be at the wrong place, at the wrong time. According to investigators, Dixie didn't immediately flee after the murder. Instead, he hid nearby, watching to see if neighbors would come outside. No lights came on, and no one stepped out. What he didn't know was that a woman had heard Sally Ann's scream, and from her darkened window, saw a man walking in the direction where the body was later discovered. Believing he had gone unnoticed, Dixie returned to the scene and desecrated Sally Ann's body before going back to the house. There, he lay down on the sofa and went to sleep. And by the next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. As part of the investigation, British detectives reached out to Australian authorities. Tests confirmed that Mark Dixie's DNA matched evidence from the assault of a Thai student in Perth in the late 1990s. On February 5, 2008, Dixie stood trial at London's Old Bailey. His cold, detached demeanor shocked everyone in the courtroom. During the proceedings, the Thai student testified that in 1998 he had attacked her with a knife and sexually assaulted her. While he had not yet been formally charged in that case, DNA recovered from her clothing was a conclusive match to him. Dixie's defense stunned the court. He admitted to assaulting Sally Ann and leaving his DNA on her body, but he denied killing her. He claimed he had stumbled upon what he believed was an unconscious, intoxicated girl and took advantage, insisting the real killer was still out there. He never offered any explanation for his appalling crimes. When it came time for the verdict, the jury was unanimous. Mark Dixie was guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years. The sentence was one of the longest minimum terms ever handed down for a single murder. It meant that before Mark Dixie could even be considered for parole, he would be at least 70 years old. He began serving his time at Belmarsh, a Category A prison reserved for the most dangerous offenders who pose a serious threat to the public. But his stay there didn't last. Other inmates threatened him, and he was soon transferred to Long Lartin. In 2014, it was revealed that he had been moved once again, this time to Franklin Prison, also for his own protection. Detective Chris LePere, part of the murder squad, described Mark Dixie as one of the most frightening individuals he had ever encountered in his career. For Sally Ann's family, the case highlighted just how crucial DNA technology had become. Her mother, Linda Bowman, became a strong advocate for a national DNA database. She believed that without forensic testing, Sally Ann's ex-boyfriend, Louis Sproston, might have been wrongfully convicted. Lead investigator Stuart Cundy agreed. In his words, a nationwide DNA register with the proper safeguards could have identified Sally Ann's killer within 24 hours. Instead, it took nearly 9 months for Dixie to be identified, and almost 2.5 years before justice was done. But despite these arguments, the push for a national database was rejected by lawmakers and government ministers, who claimed it was impractical and posed risks to civil liberties. After years of denial, in January 2015, Mark Dixie finally admitted to murdering Sally Ann Bowman. But that was only part of the story. In 2017, new charges were brought against him, and a shocking truth emerged. Another man had been wrongfully convicted for some of Dixie's crimes. Back in 2003, Dutch national Romano van der Dusen had been sentenced for the rape of 3 women on the Costa del Sol. He spent 12 years in a Spanish prison where he was routinely attacked by fellow inmates. All the while, the real offender was Mark Dixie. In June 2015, a Dutch newspaper reported that Dixie confessed to one of the assaults but denied the other 2. By 2016, Romano van der Dusen was fully acquitted. In November 2017, he sat inside Southwark Crown Court as Mark Dixie was handed 2 additional life sentences for attacks on women in Croydon. Mark Dixie's history of violence stretched back to his teenage years. At just 16, he admitted to attacking a woman in a deserted car park on Wandle Road in 1987. He tied her up, gagged her, and set her car on fire. The judge later remarked that Dixie seemed to take pleasure in her fear. After fleeing, he stole her credit card details and later called her home to taunt her. Shockingly, he phoned again the very next day. The woman was left so traumatized that she eventually moved to the countryside, desperate to escape the memories. Years later, in 2002, Dixie struck again. He attacked a woman, hitting her over the head with a kitchen knife before dragging her to an isolated spot on Selston Road, where he carried out a sexual assault. At the time, the victim had been leaving voice messages for her boyfriend. On the final recording, her screams and the sound of her phone hitting the ground could be heard. The attack was only stopped when a neighbor, alarmed by the noise, scared Dixie away. Yet even then, he used the stolen phone to call the victim's boyfriend and brag about what he had done. The woman suffered multiple skull fractures. Dixie's lack of remorse was chilling. He later remarked that it could have been worse. When Mark Dixie was sentenced in 2017 for these attacks, Detective Chris Lepere, who had also worked on Sally Ann's case, said he hoped the verdict would bring at least some measure of relief to the 2 women. He emphasized that advancements in forensic science had made it possible to finally tie Dixie to his crimes and deliver justice. For the Bowman family, no verdict could ever bring back their beloved daughter and sister. Still, they expressed deep admiration for the police, and especially for Family Liaison Officer Graham Bannatyne, whose unwavering support carried them through the darkest moments of the investigation. His presence became a source of strength when they needed it most. The damage caused by Mark Dixie is beyond measure. His crimes shattered lives. Women lived in fear. An innocent man was wrongfully imprisoned, and the Bowman family lost their daughter and sister forever. For Sally Ann's loved ones, the pain has never faded. Her sister Michelle says that each morning begins with a fleeting moment where everything feels normal, until reality crashes back. At night, she falls asleep, afraid of the memories that might return in her dreams. The nightmares never leave, and they never will. Sally Ann's story is a stark reminder of how one encounter with a predator can change lives forever. For her family, time stopped that night. For the rest of us, her name stands as a symbol of the pursuit of justice and a hope that such tragedy will never be repeated. Thank you for watching until the end. By subscribing, you're not just supporting the channel, you're helping us continue to tell the truth about real crimes.